age of consent is the minimum age to legally engage in sexual relations. The age of consent is vastly different depending on which country you're in. In the Islamic world, there is generally no age of consent at all, and Muslims can marry and have sex with children, even newborn babies. In the civilized world, however, the age of consent is generally 16 to 18. This topic is highly controversial and taboo in Western countries. It is not controversial and taboo in most other countries, especially those that are the most backward, such as the Islamic world. Generally, the higher the age of consent, the more civilized people are. In the West, there is no freedom to discuss this topic. Anyone who attempts to is suspected or accused of pedophilia. In order to avoid being suspected or accused, most Westerners will outwardly promote the highest age of consent, even as high as 30. Few Westerners have the moral and intellectual fortitude to discuss the topic. Most immigrants living in the West, however, don't have a problem with it. They will openly violate the age of consent and engage in pedophilia frequently. There is more than one type of pedophilia. The first kind, the worst kind, is sexual relations with a child that has yet not reached puberty. The second and lesser type is sexual relations with an adolescent. The third type is technical. An example of technical pedophilia is when one partner is 17 and the other is 18. In the 18-year-old state, the legal age is 18. But in the 17-year-old state, the legal age is 16. Sexual relations are legal in one state, but not the other. This is very different than the age of consent across different countries and cultures. When it comes to different countries and cultures, the age of consent is very different and very different moral standards apply. In a world full of vastly different ages of consent, understanding morality is the key. With exception to the Islamic world, the rest of the world agrees that having sexual relations with a prepubescent child is morally wrong. It is not normal for an adult to be sexually attracted to a child. Those who are perverts. What they have is a corrupt fetish. They are sexually aroused over the abuse of power they have over children. Pedophiles may claim to have a legitimate sexual attraction to children, but they are lying. What they have is a perverted and corrupt power abuse fetish. They are so morally twisted and far gone that they think their parasitic lust for exploitation of the innocent and vulnerable is normal. No one has the courage to talk about it in the West in fear of being accused, but most of the world silently agrees on this matter. Having sexual relations with a prepubescent child is wrong for many reasons. Not only is it the corruption of sexuality and the abuse of power, it damages a child's body. Their body is not yet built for sexual activity, and a little girl half the size of an adult cannot safely carry a baby. And then there is the effect sexual activity has on their mind. Being exposed to sexuality before their time takes away their childhood innocence. Instead of slowly learning about themselves constructively, they learn how to abuse their bodies for pleasure at an influential and critical time in their growth. This is why most victims of pedophilia are traumatized and scarred for life. It's like exposing children to drugs and alcohol. The Islamic world tries to justify pedophilia as practiced by their false prophet Muhammad, marrying a 6-year-old and raping her since she was 9, by claiming that girls reach puberty by the age of 9, being proven wrong. Muslims make another false claim that girls in Muhammad's day reached puberty at a younger age. They did not. If anything, girls reach puberty at a younger age today, because of a better diet. Muslims don't just marry 6-year-olds. They marry and have sexual relations with newborn babies. The example of Muhammad's pedophilia was not to set a minimum standard, but the very removal of all standards. Pedophilia was just one of Muhammad's rampantly corrupt sexual practices. He had more than 10 wives, countless sex slaves, and had sex with 10 different women and children every day. When it comes to adolescence, black and white turns to gray. This is why the age of consent in the non-Islamic world, with very rare exception, differs from 13 to 18. The age of adolescence. During early adolescence, sexuality appears. This is why children are separated from adolescents into primary and secondary schools, to avoid adolescent sexuality being exposed to children. By mid to late adolescence, sexuality is fully developed. Some argue that early adolescence is an acceptable age for sexual relations. But since their sexuality is not yet fully formed, it still isn't ready yet. By the same argument, one could say that a baby should walk because it has partially developed legs, or use the argument to justify child labor. Not many countries have an age of consent in early adolescence for this reason. Their argument doesn't hold up and they are looked down upon by the rest of the world. But it all turns to gray at the age of 14 to 15. By 14 to 15, sexuality is fully functional and both sexes have a strong sex drive. Sex drive appears not before, but partially during and predominantly after sexual maturity. Legitimate sex drive is directly related to sexual maturity. It is evolutionary. Creatures who engage in sexual activity before they are ready, die. Evolution has imprinted the age of legitimate sexual attraction of both sexes to match that of sexual maturity. If it wasn't for the legal age of consent and the politically driven indoctrination drilled into teenagers to not engage in sexual relations, they would otherwise be heavily involved in sexual activity, especially since they have a strong sex drive and poor impulse control. Many countries have an age of consent set at 14 to 15 for this reason. And then there is the age of 16 to 18. Adolescents who abstain from sexual relations until 16 to 18 are going against their nature and following politically driven cultural norms. Some of the many arguments for a higher age of consent are legitimate, while others are not. For the most part, a high age of consent is the result of the topic being taboo. Due to political correctness, the age of consent is risen to an age that no one finds offensive, and due to political correctness, the direction is now going the other way, where the LGBT cult is indoctrinating young children into engaging in perverted forms of sexuality. And then there is technical pedophilia. Morality and truth are the same no matter where you go. Just because it's legal in one state and illegal in another, doesn't make it right or wrong. It is universally right or wrong regardless of where you are in the present legal age. Many vulnerable, sexually inactive people in Western countries have been set up by pornography scammers to get caught in technical pedophilia. They are rampantly and publicly accused of pedophilia, and put in the same class as those who take advantage of prepubescent children, when it is in fact they who are being taken advantage of. An 18-year-old having sex with a 17-year-old is nothing like a 60-year-old having sex with a 5-year-old. Yet through technical pedophilia and the topic being so taboo and controversial, everyone will shout pedophile at the 18-year-old in order to virtue signal and avoid being suspected or accused themselves. It is those who virtue signal the loudest, who are often the most rampant of pedophiles of the worst kind. The hypocrisy of social norms when it comes to sexual activity and age can be seen in the fact that a wealthy man who marries a poor woman several years younger than him is called a womanizer, a pervert, a pedophile, and all kinds of names, when it is in fact she who is exploiting him for money and fame, and no one has a problem with that. Another example is in how women can sexually exploit young boys and rampantly get away with it. All men are portrayed as automatically guilty. All women are portrayed as automatically innocent. The life of an innocently accused man with no evidence is ruined just by accusing him. A woman caught in the act is instead put on a pedestal. The hypocrisy is so widespread that men generally aren't even allowed to work in daycare centers anymore, because all men are automatically accused of pedophilia by women who are often pedophiles themselves. When it comes to sexual exploitation, which is the primary reason behind the age of consent, it is women who are by far the most guilty. Taboo aside, the main purpose of having a higher age of consent beyond the normal age of sexual activity is not for physical reasons, but intellectual reasons. Adolescents aren't intellectually ready for the consequences of sexual activity, such as being parents. They are still dependent and learning about the basics of life. This is why children in civilized countries aren't allowed to work, and instead go to school. It's why adolescents aren't allowed to drive until they're 16, and not allowed to vote until they're 18. And in the case of the USA, not allowed to drink alcohol until they're 21. Because adolescents aren't intellectually ready for the world, they are easily exploited by experienced adults. Sexual exploitation is wrong regardless of age. But in order to give adolescents a chance, the age of consent is risen to avoid sexual exploitation by adults. The age of consent in any given country or state does not define right or wrong. It's the result of many factors, most of which are political and have nothing to do with right or wrong. So long as both parties have a legitimate sexual attraction to each other and there is no exploitation, there is nothing wrong with it.